for implementing National Adaptation Plans, which we are organizing as part of the activities designed to launch the Adaptation Finance Strategy Guideline, which UNDP has developed as a collaboration between its climate and sustainable finance hubs, with funding support from the United Kingdom and Sweden. I'm Rohini Kohli. I'm the Senior Technical Advisor for Adaptation Planning and Policy, and very, very glad to be here with all of you. Before we dive into the webinar, I'd like to ask for your cooperation with a few housekeeping matters. Firstly, we would like to ask you to ensure that your microphones are off. We will have an interactive session later, and we will invite you to ask questions at that point. Secondly, on the subject of questions, feel free to post questions in the chat at any time. My colleagues will monitor these, and we will have a chance for discussion later. Some of them might be very easy to answer, so they will be answered directly, but the rest will be in the interaction. Finally, I'd like to let you know that the webinar is being recorded, and we will make the recording available to all the registered participants after the event. To give you an overview of today's agenda, first, we have opening remarks from Mr. Gerd Trogenman, Manager Regional Program of the Global Network of UNDP, the Global Policy Network of UNDP. After that, my colleagues Christina Gregory and Liam Fee, who I'll introduce later, will give the keynote presentation that will introduce the Adaptation Finance Strategy Guidelines. Then we will have a panel discussion featuring speakers from Uganda and the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, the World Bank, and the NAP Global Network. We'll then have an interactive session for about 20 minutes. And we are fortunate to have Emma Wright from the UK FCDO, one of the donors who supported the development of the guideline, to provide closing remarks. Given our packed agenda, I would like to hand straight to Gerd Trogenman to provide his opening remarks. Gerd, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rohini, and greetings to all participants. Thank you for joining this webinar entitled Unlocking Climate Finance Strategies for Implementing National Adaptation Plans. Allow me upfront to acknowledge the participation of partners from governments, from development organizations, financial institutions, and networks. This includes the NAP Global Network, the World Bank, the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. It includes FCDO, of course, and colleagues from GIZ, from CPI, ADB, UNEP, the OECD, and many, many others. Thank you all for making time to join us. The urgency to address the impacts of climate change can hardly be overstated, as we know. The 2025 UNEP Adaptation Gap Report, as you saw in the concept note for this webinar, states that by 2035, developing countries will require between 310 to 365 billion annually for adaptation. Yet international public finance stands only at around $26 billion per year at the moment. This massive financial gap threatens communities, economies, and ecosystems worldwide, especially in these turbulent times. Clearly, the scale and efficiency of public finance needs to be enhanced, tapping all funding sources and the full diversity of funding that can be made available. UNDP works with governments globally to translate SDGs and climate commitments into actionable policy. UNDP's Climate Promise Program, our climate change adaptation team, and many partners have been instrumental in supporting countries to prepare national adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions. More than 75 countries have now developed their NAPs, demonstrating an unprecedented level of commitment to climate resilience. UNDP has been supporting 45 of these around the world. The challenge ahead is to ensure that these plans are implemented and that the financing needed, whether domestic, international, or private, is mobilized and aligned effectively. UNDP supports climate change adaptation in over 100 countries under 4 strategic pillars. This is first, finance and de-risking; second, integrated solutions; third, locally led adaptation; and fourth, institutionalizing adaptation policy. Thematically, UNDP's adaptation portfolio spans across 10 thematic areas: adaptation policy and planning, livelihoods, fostering resilience for food security, nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation, water resource management and access to water, coastal adaptation, climate information and early warning systems, urban climate resilience, climate and health, and climate resilient infrastructure. In Asia and the Pacific, through the Climate Finance Network, we have been assisting ministries of finance in taking data-based climate integrated decisions on development plans and in applying innovative financing solutions. We are connecting strongly to the NAPs and the NDCs developed in countries. The Adaptation Finance Strategy Guideline we are discussing today has been developed by UNDP's adaptation team and the Climate Finance Network with support from the UK's Climate Action for a Resilient Asia, the CARA program, and by the government of Sweden through Sida. The guideline was developed in consultation with development partners, including ADB, the OECD, the World Bank, the NAPGN, and many others. The guideline provides a very practical modular framework to help governments strengthen systems, prioritize investments, and match financing needs with viable sources, public and private. So in this webinar today, colleagues, we will walk you through the framework organized around its 4 core phases: engagement and data collection, investment prioritization, mapping and matching financing needs and sources, operational planning and coordination. These steps are not theoretical. They are first grounded in lessons from countries already working to operationalize adaptation at scale. And second, they're based on proven business models that make adaptation investments bankable, sustainable, and responsive to local needs. So the objective, therefore, of this webinar is to introduce the guideline in the first place, of course, but also to create a space for dialogue across partners, across governments, development organizations, financial institutions, and networks present here tonight, or today, let me put it that way. I don't know from which time zone you're connecting, and to show how different guidance and frameworks complement each other, and how together we can help close the adaptation finance gap. As UNDP, we do look forward to continuing our collaboration with all of you, with development partners and financial institutions, to narrow the adaptation finance gap. We look forward to supporting countries in implementing the NAPs and NDCs through access to finance and to linking adaptation processes with broader SDG finance mechanisms. Adaptation finance is not only an economic or financial concern. It is about the people at the front lines of climate change and how we can help and support them to be more resilient to these challenges. Many thanks again to all our panelists, the Global NAP Network, the World Bank, the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, FCDO, and all other partners joining us today. And thank you for participating from all around the world. Your engagement is essential as we work collectively to support countries in building resilient, climate-secure futures. With that, I should leave more time for the discussion and stop talking for too long in the opening part. Rohini, back to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Gerd, for setting the scene for the webinar. It's late in Asia, I think, for many participants who are joining from Asia, and indeed for our to you and our colleagues from Bangkok. So it's great to have that framing. Now, being sort of mindful of time, I wanted to actually pass to my colleague, Christina Gregorio, who is a regional climate finance specialist at the Climate Finance Network of the UNDP Asia and the Pacific, and Mr. Liam Fee, who is an adaptation planning specialist in UNDP's Climate Hub. So Christina and Liam were the UNDP technical leads on this guideline. And it was a guideline, really a very consultative guideline across many units of UNDP, as well as a lot of external partners who are very lucky to have today with. And in their presentation, they'll highlight the approach and the key features. So Liam, I believe you're starting the presentation, and I'm going to hand over to you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Rohini, and thank you very much to Gerd for your opening remarks. I think that perfectly frames what we want to say here in this presentation. It's great to see so many people on this webinar, already over 200 people from all over the world. And so what we're going to do with this presentation is to give a bird's eye view of what is contained in the Adaptation Finance Strategy Guideline. We're making the assumption here that many of you will not have seen the guideline before. This is the first time that you will have seen it. So we're going to give a sort of 15-minute overview of what is contained within the guideline, with the download link to come at the end. Melanie, next slide, please. So I would like to pick up on something that Garrett mentioned in his opening remarks and something that we had in the concept for this webinar, which is this quite remarkable statistic that came out of the Adaptation Gap report released by UNEP last year, which is that the adaptation finance needs in developing countries could reach up to 365 billion US dollars per year by 2035, against a current international public finance flow of around 26 billion US dollars per year. So obviously there is a very significant shortfall in international public finance for adaptation. Now, there are different sources of finance for adaptation, private finance, domestic public finance, but what this tells us is that there is a very, very clear shortfall in finance for investment in adaptation. And even though we have seen countries make a lot of progress in terms of developing and submitting national adaptation plans, developing third generation NDCs, these in and of themselves are not leading to adaptation finance, scaled up adaptation finance. And so part of the broader aim here of the Adaptation Finance Strategy Guideline is to bridge the gap between planning, policy, and commitments and the need for scaled up adaptation finance. Next slide, please, Melanie. So just a background and an overview to the guidelines. This was a joint initiative of UNDP's Sustainable Finance and Planet Hubs, as Gerd mentioned, and was released back in January of this year. The guideline is designed to be a practical, country-driven framework to translate adaptation priorities into investable strategies and finance flows. The purpose is to support ministries and agencies in formulating viable and inclusive adaptation finance strategies that are designed to complement existing investment plans, but also to complement the tools and frameworks that have been developed by a variety of international partners, including the World Bank and IISD NAP Global Network, who we will hear from later on in this webinar about how this work is complementing each other. And as I mentioned in my introduction, to support countries to be able to implement their NAPs and NDCs, which in and of themselves are not leading to increased finance flows. And the why and the how are that the guideline can be used for different aspects of accelerating adaptation, including the investment planning process, but also to support investment planning in specific sectors or at the subnational level. Why is that important? Well, national adaptation plans typically target 3, 4, 5, 6 different priority sectors, usually agriculture, water, often public health, infrastructure, urban resilience, things like that. So they can target specific sectors where there is a need for investment, or at the subnational level, because in some countries there is decentralized framework. So local planning becomes important. Next slide, please. So there's 3 guiding principles in the guideline. Firstly, to be country-driven and fit for purpose. Just like the NAP process, the adaptation finance strategy should be determined by a country's needs, priorities, and desired outcomes, and should also be fit for purpose, reflecting the stage and the priorities that are already there in the NAP and the NDC. The second is that this process should engage ministries of finance and planning. In NAP and NDC, that is usually under the purview of ministries of environment. But here, because we're talking about finance, it's important that we engage ministries of finance and ministry of planning. And thirdly, to take a participatory and inclusive approach that includes representation from across government, recognizing the many different sectors that are involved, the private sector, development partners, civil society, and representative of women's groups and potentially marginalized and very vulnerable communities. Next slide, please. So the content, very briefly, the guideline is organized around this four-phased approach. And the rest of this presentation is going to focus on that four-phased approach. And that's what we will describe here. But I do just want to point out that there is a glossary because there is some technical language in the guideline and also the annexes. And I don't want to dwell on this too much, but it's easy to skip over annexes in a guideline like this, but I would encourage you to have a look at them because these are practical tools and examples of the different things like business models that are very important to how the guideline is structured. So the annexes are designed to be very practical and usable. Next slide, please. So the four-phased approach, what are the four phases? Phase one is engagement data collection. Phase two, investment prioritization. Phase three, mapping and matching finances, needs and sources. And phase four, operational planning and coordination for the adaptation finance strategy. Next slide, please. So phase one, engagement data collection. The goal here is to build a strong foundation of needs, budgets, and financial flows. And important here is demand side and supply side. So what does that mean? Demand side is understanding the needs. Needs are basically what we mean here by demand. So the sector priorities, the costed investments that have been included in the National Adaptation Plan and NDC, and existing budgets and financing gaps. Right? Supply side data basically means the financing flows, current and potential in countries from the various types of finance that you see here on the slide, NBFIs, non-bank financial institutions, so things like microcredit, mobile money providers, that kind of thing, as well as capital markets and private sector investments, as well as identifying any constraints and bottlenecks that may exist in either the supply or the demand side. So fragmented data or data not being available, which is a challenge everywhere, low creditworthiness, high levels of indebtedness, things like that, that would be constraints for mobilizing additional adaptation finance. Next slide, please, Melanie. Phase two is around investment prioritization. The goal here is to produce a prioritized costed adaptation investment plan by prioritizing and costing sectoral investment and developing business models and assessing financing demands. So that sounds like a lot, but what it basically means is developing business models for adaptation finance. And the guide structures these into three types: projects with revenue streams, projects that could potentially generate revenue, but don't necessarily do so at the minute, either because of project structures or because of certain regulatory or other constraints, and projects that are public good type projects. That means they don't generate revenue in and of themselves. They may protect or they provide a public good, but they don't generate a cash flow revenue. And in doing this, we apply a gender responsive and social inclusive criteria so that the prioritized investments are prioritizing the needs of the most vulnerable communities in the target area. And so with that, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Christina, who will take you through the rest of the presentation. Christina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Liam, and good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all our participants today. So moving on, in the second phase of the financing strategy, as Liam mentioned, it focuses on business models and financing mechanisms. So it is quite important for us to be able to identify the investment type of the solutions that are identified in, for example, phase one. So some of the investments would be climate proofing projects that could focus on a wide range of sectors. So as Liam mentioned, the NAPs could cover 6 sectors or more, or adaptation priorities could also be reflected or integrated in the NDCs. In the actual report or in the guideline, you will see that we have examples based on the UAE principles for adaptation as well. And the second type of investment type is the financing for adaptation-focused projects. So in this case, you will also see that these are projects with current revenue streams, but with options to generate further. A third type is the public good, where important activities that contribute to reducing the underlying causes of vulnerability to climate change and removing barriers to adaptation. So in this case, when it's a public good, there is likely no realistic prospect of achieving a dedicated revenue stream. So this is where public budgets would be very much essential in terms of sources of finance. Next slide, please. So in the particular guideline, still on phase 2, which is focused on identifying the suitable business model and financing mechanism, we've also identified the different types of projects or based on the MDB classification, and also provide descriptions and examples as regards if each type is more direct or localized in terms of the community and what type of revenue model would be applicable. So for example, for climate proofing projects with cost recovery options, this would usually include user fees, tariffs, or private contracts. So for example, for the water sector, there are user fees for utilizing or accessing water. And so for the off-takers would be the one paying or be the one for the cost recovery. Second one, or the type 2 type of investment would be adaptation projects with partial cost recovery. So this is where blended finance or PPP arrangements could come in, where there would be a combination of public and private resources. So as you can see, examples would be land value captures, blended tariffs, ecosystem services payments, or local levies. For public goods, for example, let's say a water project in a rural area where the users would not be able to afford to pay the fees, then this is where your transfers or insurance premiums or subsidies and grants would be most useful. So in this case, the benefits could not necessarily be monetizable. Next slide, please. So also in this phase, the guideline we have also shows various model archetypes. So as we discussed the business models in the previous slide and also the revenue source, we also show the different types of how relevant it is in the types of investment, if it's type 1, type 2, or type 3. So for example, for a full cost recovery commercial PPP investment, for example, it is high type 1 kind of alignment in terms of its relevance to adaptation. Whereas, for example, area-based public finance, which we always see, for example, in flood control projects, housing or resilience housing projects, it would require LVCs or special levies. And then, so this is where identifying the beneficiaries would be more important because this is where you can contribute and identify the type of benefits that you could get from the investment. Next slide, please. So moving on to phase 3, this is where this is more the supply side of the financing strategy. So whereas in phase 2, we looked at the different enabling environment, the demand side of it, meaning the agencies that would be implementing the particular projects whom they have identified in terms of investments across type 1, type 2, and type 3. For phase 3, the goal is identifying and aligning financing sources with prioritized investments and designing and identifying financing instruments and enabling frameworks. So on the demand side, it's one thing to identify the problem or the adaptation priority. It's another to identify the business model that is commensurate to that particular solution based on the revenue model, for example, or the adaptation relevance. But in phase 3, now we go through the different financing sources, as you could see on the screen, and how these financing sources would be able to match on the suitable financing mechanism or financing modality. So fund sources is who pays, but the how is where the financing modality, financing instrument, and financing mechanism comes in. So as you can see, each source here, international, national, or private sector, would also be able to be proponents of various types of financing mechanisms, financing instruments, despite essentially being like a same kind of category as a fund source. Similarly, because now at this age, I think for the upcoming UNEP report, for example, they would also be focusing on domestic finance, and traditionally based on climate finance flows assessments, public budgets have still been the highest sources of adaptation finance. Private sector and innovative finance sources have also been increasingly very important in terms of plugging the adaptation gap. And so you can see here that for innovative finance, issuance of green and blue bonds, whether sovereign or non-sovereign, of course, blended finance and carbon markets and guarantees for de-risking is also very important. So this is the stage where the proponents or the ones developing a financing strategy would be able to identify not just the mechanisms and the source, but also the instrument. And lastly, this is the part also where we're not just talking about the sources of finance and the modality of the finance, but also how we could strengthen the enabling environments, for example, through domestic capital markets and creating enabling environments. So for example, in the issuance of a green or blue bond, taxonomies are very important in the same way that incentives to increase engender private sector engagement, particularly for philanthropists in terms of outputs and results and how they support the communities that they needed to serve. So this is where these kind of discussions are coming in, and we provide examples across various sectors in the guideline. Next slide, please. And for phase 4, this is where everything comes together. So from strategies into implementation. So this is where we consolidate the data in phase 1, the demand information on phase 2, and then the supply of financing from phase 3, and prioritize the investments into a multi-sector plan by aligning supply and demand. But if you remember, Liam did mention that although the guideline is designed as a multi-sector plan, this guideline could also be applied at the sector level for the entire NAP or the adaptation segments of the NDC. It could also be applied, let's say, at the subnational level, maybe village level, province level, or a community level. But in this stage, it would be very important to have a focal point. So let's say an adaptation finance coordinating agency, maybe the International Finance Group or Climate Finance Group of a particular Ministry of Finance or Environment, a lead agency to consolidate the sector priorities into an investment plan. And of course, it is in this stage where it's necessary to understand and conduct a fiscal space analysis and align which aspects of the investment could be supported by domestic budgets and where other partners could come in. So this is where one could determine and assess the business models determined in phase 2 would be useful for operationalizing the productive guideline. And I think lastly this is also very important, is that in this particular stage, this is where we also identify the capacity gaps, any regulatory barriers, any policy pronouncement that needs to be in place to be able to access finance. So this may be very specific in the adaptation thematic area, or it could also be very specific in the sector or the governance level where the investment will be taking place. And lastly, aligned with UNFCCC's Enhanced Transparency Framework, our guideline also includes a section on monitoring, reporting, and verification. So in this case, as we spend public budgets, and I think it's not just public, but also private sector, the increased importance of accountability and transparency relies so much on having a very reputable MRV system. Next slide, please. So in the guideline, you will also see a discussion on why an MRV is important in crafting a financing strategy. As I mentioned earlier, it contributes to transparency. It could contribute to tracking of climate finance, and of course, also engaging development partners in across the different guidelines or safeguards that the partners also have, especially if they're supporting any of the investments. So we have a log frame in that guideline. So please if you have time to read it also, just to see how an MRV is useful. And we're citing the case of Colombia, where the Ministry of Finance have really integrated the use of climate budget tagging, for example, and the external income and external resources to be able to track the performance of the funds that have been allocated for climate. Next slide, please. So last slide on this keynote presentation is just summarizing the 4 phases of the climate, our financing strategy guideline. As you can see, the phase 1 focuses more on data collection. So for countries that already have let's say a development finance assessment, or they already have a climate change fiscal framework where they already have the institutional arrangements documented, they could proceed with phase 2. So as Leah mentioned, this is not a sequential type of framework, but it's modular, meaning if the information is available already in phase 1, or you already have a NAP that is costed or a sector that is costed, then you could begin and proceed with phase 2 right away. So as a summary, you will see here for phase 3 that it's very important to be able to identify the sources and the enabling frameworks across different levels, whether it's domestic and international. And of course, the most important part is when it all comes together in phase 4, in terms of mapping the resources, identifying the gaps, ensuring that the performance assessment is monitored. And in the guideline, you will also see that it would take about 5 months to be able to prepare or do all of these phases at a country level or a sector level or at a subnational level. And with that, I think we can go to the next slide. And we encourage everybody to read at your leisure. You could see the QR code here and you could download both the full report and the executive summary from this link. Thank you very much. And over to you, Rohini.
Wow, thank you so much, Liam and Christina. That's I think a very comprehensive presentation on this guideline. And we're actually going to encourage all all the colleagues, on the friends and others that have joined, if they want to put some questions in the chat, because we are really going to open question and answers later, once we have also heard from our panelists. But I think there is a lot of material in this, and I'm sure there will also be a lot of questions, some of which we try to deal with later, and then we plan to make sure that there is an ongoing conversation on this work. So I think maybe with that, I'd like to actually and then we've put the link in the chat where you can download the lines. And then I'd like to actually move to our panel discussion. We have put together this panel in a way that we can hear, some complementarity, but also some diverse perspectives on adaptation finance needs and approaches, and also how the different efforts are complementing each other. And I actually, with great pleasure, I'd like to introduce our first panelist. I hope he's online, which is Dr. Sam Mugume Kujo, and he is the Assistant Commissioner in the Macroeconomic Policy Department of the Government of Uganda. He's extremely experienced. He has over 25 years of leadership in macroeconomic policy analysis, statistical analysis, and sustainable development, and is a very key member of the coalition, the Secretariat of the Coalition of Finance Ministers in the Adaptation Working Group. He has expertise in climate change economics and research on mitigation and adaptation strategies. I just want to make sure, Sam, are you there? Just if you can hear me.
I can hear you loud and clear, Roy. Can you hear
Sam?
me?
Yes, you're very clear. And actually, before I give you the floor, I think amongst the sort of key points you're going to address is to frame the challenge that developing countries face in terms of converting their adaptation priorities, the NDC NAP commitments, into a pipeline of investments, and the role of finance ministries in contributing, coordinating. But we know we cannot limit you to these questions, so we just want to hear your perspective, and I'm going to hand the floor to you now. Thank you. And Sam, I think you're on mute.
Okay, I had put off the glasses. I wasn't seeing what I was.
Okay, thank you.
I'm now okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're very clear.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm outside, so there's the sun, beam coming, and I wanted to remove the glasses so people see me, but I can't see. So allow me to keep them on, and please don't mind, I will put them off. You can see my eyes properly. But it's a big pleasure to be here today and to be invited to speak when this great guide is being launched and given to us. Really great appreciation from UNDP and the entire team for having this out. I'm Sam Mugume, like they've told you. I come from Minister of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, Uganda, number one. But number two, we are co-chairs of the Coalition of Finance Ministers on Climate Action. And what we're doing is exactly what this guide is telling us to do, is to bring Minister of Finance to make sure that what is provided for as climate action, as adaptation, is clearly put in terms of investments and provides for financial flows. So we really appreciate that, both as a country, my country, Uganda, but also as the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. We are 102 countries. Now, there are some few things, the presentation from Liam, it was very clear. There are things that are key. Why we have the NDC, we have the NAPs. How about getting pipeline investments right and getting them get the money? the guide will help us. But number one, that's very key from my angle. I've been in this for some time, is the alignment of these strategic policy investments, commitments to the national planning frameworks in the national development plans and the national budgets. How do we bring them? What are the investments? And do they speak to the country's objectives? There's enough knowledge right now that investment in adaptation, especially in adaptation, increases economic growth, brings out clean jobs, and more opportunities for development. Are we aligning these to the national priorities, which we should be able to do? And for me, the guide speaks to this. And what we do as ministers of finance is now, it's very, very important and more critical to have ministers of finance get involved in the preparation of these policies and commitments, and then the bankable and projects that are within the pipelines to make them clear and to make them be invested. I'm looking at, when I'm talking about projects, I'm looking at projects that are going to be funded by the local revenue, country revenues, and the external public revenue and private revenue. So they should be linked and they should be talking to the challenge of the day, which is important. And I'm very happy that the guide we're speaking about now is an adaptation financing strategy guideline, which speaks to us. The second big challenge is, yes, you may have this, but the financial architecture, both at local level and global level, does it look at this in the right way? Do we understand it as ministers of finance? Or is it being done by the scientists? We've started understanding, I've seen there's a good trend of ministers of finance planning and economic development agencies starting to understand that getting to invest in adaptation is very critical for development. That's where the gains are. That's where resilience comes from. But the financial architecture within the country, does it understand? When I sit in the boardroom in the Ministry of Finance, do I think of what is happening within the NDCs commitments? Do they speak to the day-to-day challenge of the economic, and social political challenge that I'm dealing with to put the money? These are the questions that I'm trying to answer. These are the questions we should be answering. And these are the questions that the guide is helping to answer. And then, how do we remove the silos? How do we remove the silos? We're trying. I'll give you an example in Uganda, what we've done. Still difficult. It's in the process. We are moving away from sector planning, programmatic planning. We have 18 programs now, and these are where we think sectors can fit, but still a challenge, as you know. This is the one way to go. We are here discussing, I'm in a meeting right now where we're discussing about country platforms and frameworks of financing and ensuring that there are bankable projects which are funded. So silo is still a problem which we should be able to move away from and be able to make sure that our investments are right. Now, what is the role of Minister of Finance in this? One, we should be able to have tools, good tools that can be able to evaluate the impacts and opportunities and benefits commitments that we're making, and then translate this in actionable and implementable investments for the country and for the community. Two is that we should be able now to change the way we are planning, the way we are budgeting. I always ask people that I sit with, when will we invest in a road infrastructure? When we invest in ensuring that we have good drainage in Kampala City, is this adaptation? Yes, if it's adaptation, why don't we look at it as an investment in that way? So also from our end, there's a lot of things to do to change within the Ministry of Finance to be able to align ourselves. The guide that is being launched today is very key. But I want to add on that. In addition to this guide, the Coalition of Finance Ministers on Climate Action has also a guide on how to bring in Minister of Finance to think critically about what the guide is talking. So together, we'll do a lot, and we need to keep together, but the involvement of Minister of Finance Planning and involvement is key, and also making sure that we run away from the working in silos to come to work together and aligning our projects to the national development framework, planning framework. I want to stop here. And I know the discussion is going to be good and going on, but once again, thank you so much for inviting me and congratulations for having this document out. Thank you. Let me remove these glasses so that you see me properly.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sam. I think in a very, I would say, very succinct way, you have actually discussed something which you are really doing on a day-to-day basis, which is quite complex. And I think you've actually picked up some very important issues, and you have the real life experience of doing it. I think you've spoken about the issue of the financial architecture. Is it fit for purpose? These NDCs or the National Adaptation Plans, are they really talking about the economic realities of the day to day? And are they aligned with the development plan or the development strategies of the country and what the finance ministry has to, look at it critically? And it's actually very important to have, institutions like yours in the conversation, because the climate world there's a lot of environment discussion happening, but there is, I think, more and more discussion with the finance ministries and also financial actors and investors. There's more discussion happening between all. So breaking those silos, but it's far from perfect. There's a lot to go. But thank you so much for that perspective. And we could hear you very clearly. And please do stay online if you can. And now I'd actually like to take, and sorry, Dr. Sam, if we know you have a busy day. We hope you can stay as long as you can. So it depends, it also. So I think with that, I would actually like to introduce our next speaker, Maribel Hernandez. Maribel is a senior policy advisor with the NAP Global Network. And she's a climate finance and private sector engagement specialist with a lot of experience, more than 20 years. She supports countries in structuring adaptation financing strategies and plans, expanding financial instruments, and connecting adaptation needs with climate finance sources. Welcome, Maribel. And if you could please tell us what lessons have you learned from applying tools and guidance in the partner countries that you work with through the NAP Global Network, and which can also be linked or applied to the Adaptation Finance Strategy Guidelines? And what are the emerging challenges and opportunities relating to financing strategies and investment planning in the countries you're working with? So over to you, Maribel.
Thank you, Rohini, and thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here today for this webinar. So yes, some lessons from applying similar guidelines or tools to the countries we support. So I would maybe like to start with the asking this very important question: is it the right time to apply this guidance? Is it the right time to utilize the tool? It might seem evident, but sometimes it is not. And we need to make sure that the guidelines, that the tools that we are going to apply align with the country's objectives and needs at this very moment. So do we need to get ready before applying these guidelines? What is that the country needs now? Because countries are at different stages of the NAP process. So yeah, there could be, there are many differences from one country to another. And this is important to also avoid duplicating efforts and work. And also, and very important, because we know that one of the limitations is that country teams working on adaptation and adaptation finance are small. This is also a way to make sure that we are not overwhelming country teams with something that they don't really need now. So it's very important to know what is the needs and objectives of the country before launching these processes. My second lesson or recommendation, I don't know, is to keep this practical and to find the balance between the amount of information to get informed decision-making processes and avoid sort of overloading the process, and also try to use as much as possible the information, the institutional arrangements, etc., which already exists. And for this, the NAP process could be a good entry point, because most of the countries, even countries that doesn't have a NAP document, they have a NAP process in place from which they could build and draw and help with all this to make the process smooth. So the first thing that we can do is to identify the data, the information, everything that we need to apply these tools, to apply this guidance beforehand. And as I said, try to use what is as much as possible the existing data to go through this process. And also flexibility. I think flexibility is key. We need to follow the natural planning logic of the country. We can't sort of impose something which is not going to work. And also what we have noticed is that when we propose clear step-by-step approach, this is also helping to gain confidence, because we have to keep in mind that this is an iterative process, right? We are in a dynamic system, climate is changing. We can see that the socioeconomic and political, geopolitical circumstances are changing. So this is something that we have to repeat. This is an iterative exercise. So if we have a clear step-by-step approach, country teams will gain in confidence and will be, this exercise could be, in the end is that the need for countries to adapt the process and, use something that it would be something that they could repeat easily afterwards. Also, I think another element that helps is when we have a process which produces tangible outcomes early in the process, for different reasons, because this is also helping bring in other actors to the table, and so it also have these inputs, these outputs, sorry, could be like feeding existing conversations with the planning officers, with the ministries of finance, and it is also a good way of showing how each actor is involved through this concrete outcomes. So it is also a way of bringing very important actors to the table as well. And this, of course, if we use it is also important to use the language and sometimes even the formats of the actors that are going to be involved, like for instance ministries of finance, like like brief, like figures, like they like brief reports, etc. So adapt this to the final recipient of the information. And finally, something which is I think very well reflected in your guidelines is the need for a participatory approach from the beginning. Because all these guidelines become more powerful when all key actors are involved from the beginning of the process. And as I say, when the information is presented in a way and using the language which is understood by each of the actors involved. So very briefly, and as a very brief summary on the lessons, I would say, choosing the appropriate time to launch the process and be sure that it is aligned with the needs and priorities of the country. Be flexible and pragmatic. Try to produce concrete outputs as soon as possible in the process, and to also avoid disengagement, right? We don't want these long processes and where we don't see clearly what is going to be the output. And finally, make sure that this is built into a very robust approach. On the challenges, I think some of them have already been mentioned by Dr. Sam. What we see, for instance, is that many countries still have limited cost and economic data. So when they are even building the investments on, or when they are appraising them, they realize that they don't have the basic costing and economic data to do so. At the NAP Global Network, we have developed what we call the NAP costing tool, which is a tool that has been applied in different countries and helps. It's a sort of providing a template that is helping cost adaptation options. Another challenge, Dr. Sam has mentioned that already is, and we receive a lot of requests from countries in this regard, is how we translate a national priority or a sectoral priority into a concrete investment, into something that could be used to look for funding. So this is also where guidelines like yours could be very useful. We have also developed some frequently asked questions about adaptation investment planning that could be helping on this. Coordination is also key, because different actors, they don't have the same understanding about adaptation priorities and how they fit into planning and budgeting processes at the national level. And this is even more challenging when there are budget constraints, which is very common, unfortunately. And we know that adaptation often competes with other development priorities, and fiscal space is tight. So, we need to, push for a good coordination with all the actors involved. And finally, we are seeing something which is interesting, and I think is good, is that countries are starting thinking out of the box and looking at, what other financial instruments, what other sources they could tap into beyond, vertical funds, and we who are very, very important, but we know now that public international finance is not enough. So we see that countries are starting thinking innovative instruments, but they are already not very familiar with those instruments, how they work. What is the what are the institutional arrangements? What is that they need to have in place before implementing those instruments? So this is something that could be a challenge. We have developed an inventory of innovative financial instruments that is available at the website of the NAPGN, and we have also developed with GIZ an analysis of different innovative financial instruments that could help bring more private sector investment to adaptation. So I can send you all this information later. And then on the opportunities, so looking for more innovative instruments, I think it's a very, very good opportunity. And something that we are seeing is that there is a shift towards finance mix approach. So not focusing only on one source, not focusing only on one instruments like grants for technical assistance plus concessional loans. So as I said, like this shift towards a finance mix approach to combine domestic budget, international public finance, private sources of finance, innovative instruments. I think it's a very positive aspect. Another one is the strong interest from countries in climate budget tagging, which, as we all know, has a lot of advantages to improve transparency, to strengthen accountability, to make the climate spending more visible, but also it's also a way of demonstrating that the country is committed in adaptation, and it's also a good way to leverage more and additional finance. And finally, I think there is a great opportunity from learning from peers, from countries that have experienced different ways of unlocking adaptation finance, and share learning and experience. And this is something that UNDP does a lot, and we at the NAP Global Network, this is one of the pillars of the support that we provide to countries. So yeah, so this is in a nutshell some of the ideas that I can.
Thank you thank you so much, Maribel. That was very, very comprehensive. I think, but also very clear, because the issue of adaptation finance often feels overwhelming and very complex. And I think that you've sort of identified the importance of making sure that there is the importance of timing, keeping it practical, but also like learning from each other, for like, and the best learning happens between peers, peer to peer exchange between countries, and certain actors, especially as, I mean, there's a lot of learning to be done on many, issues. We know vertical funds are not, as you said, they're important, but that's not the whole story. But countries also want to learn about, bankability vis-a-vis vertical funds. Or then there is at a higher level the NAP costing, right? The NAP Global Network has a costing tool. And then there are these innovative instruments looking at diverse sources of finance. I think this is the area which requires the most kind of effort and thinking, I think, at the moment. And, and where I think a lot of collective sharing and all of that is extremely important. And I think you've actually, I think, hit upon something important, that it's a very dynamic and iterative exercise. There has to be a lot of learning through the process, and it'll have to keep getting repeated, because adaptation in investments have to be ongoing and have to continue. And it's only by actually learning by doing, being able to talk to financiers, investors, and try to have a conversation with them and identify. There's so many questions in the chat actually about many of the dimensions of this, but really having that conversation, in terms of really, how to get those concessional loans, or some things are not akin to revenue streams. So there's a lot, I think, going on, and there's a lot of learning to be had with each experience. So the tools are very useful, but we do not want to overwhelm just with tools. We need to be able to apply them. So thank you so much for that. And then I think I'm going to actually go to our next panelist. I'm very happy to introduce Richard Sutherland. He's a senior governance specialist. I just want to check if Richard is online. Yes, I think yeah. So he's a senior, welcome Richard. You're a senior governance specialist and the program lead of sustainability governance at the Public Finance and Procurement Unit at the World Bank. And it's great to have you here. I think we actually posed you many, many questions that you could cover, in terms of looking at, the role of MDBs in adaptation finance, tools, products, complementarity. But I think we also received a question in the chat about bankability of pipeline investments. And this is a recurring question. And if you can also shed light on that, it would be great. Otherwise, we can take that in the Q&A. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me echo other speakers in saying it is truly a pleasure to be here, to join this very timely discussion. Before I begin, let me just say that, let me emphasize that we're really at an important moment in the adaptation agenda, where many countries have done the hard work of developing plans and strategies around adaptation and mitigation and so on, clarifying their priorities, setting strategic directions, and all of these things. The challenge now is really, how do we move from these ambitious strategies or the intent that they imply to implementation, and implementation at scale? Just by way of context, the World Bank supports adaptation planning and financing through a range of entry points, from projects to policy financing, risk-based instruments, and all these things. I'm speaking specifically from a governance and public finance perspective, which is one of the important pieces that of this broader engagement. So from that vantage point, the key question I'd like to focus on in response to some of the questions raised is really this. How do we translate adaptation's priorities into really financed, implementable, feasible investments at scale? And what role the bank and other MDBs play in responding to that question? As was said in the opening remarks, I think many countries, especially vulnerable countries today, do not lack adaptation plans. With more than 70 plans already in place, the real question is no longer what to do, but really how do we translate these adaptation priorities into these feasible investment strategies? And that is why I really think that the Adaptation Finance Strategy Guide is very timely. It's timely because it focuses explicitly on moving from plans to projects, from priorities to financing decisions. And I think that's what is really necessary at this stage. So what does it actually take to move from adaptation priority to a finance investment? From the World Bank's perspective, what is especially useful about the guide is its four-phase structure, which really mirrors how many governments and financiers actually work. At the bank, for example, our contribution really sits mainly at the intersection of phase 3 and phase 4, where financing strategies have to be institutionalized to deliver at scale. Phase 3, principally looking at matching financing needs with the resourcing and instruments, while phase 4 is about operational planning. These two phases are really where the bank has a comparative advantage. Now, across our work, especially our work on national adaptation plans, NDCs, and long-term strategies, even further upstream, national development planning, we see a recurrent problem or a recurrent pattern that raises really an uncomfortable question. And the question is this: if priorities are clear and financing options are known, why does delivery still lag? Many of the countries we engage with have a problem, an implementation problem, where the strategies are there, but typically the adaptation is not fully embedded in institutions that decide on budgets, that decide on investments, that are dealing with the financing trade-offs. So this is the central message of some of our work, for example, recent work on translating LTSs from paper to practice. It applies directly to NAPs as well. Adaptation strategies fail not because they lack ambition, but because they are not anchored in core institutions that deal with planning, that deals with budgeting, that deals with investment systems, that deals with some of the siloed problems that Sam raised earlier. So these are some of the practical challenges that may create bottlenecks to enabling these financing strategies to actually become reality. So the framework, the guide that was launched today, it really creates a bridge that is very useful, but can go much further in attaining an impact if the changes implied by the guide change how governments actually make decisions, not just what they write in the document, but actually how they make those decisions. So what does translation look like in practice? Let me give you a simple illustration. So many NAPs include priorities such as, for example, urban flooding or water scarcity, trying to secure some of these things. These are often treated as, many cases, fully public expenditures. But that is not always necessary. In practice, a common, often well-documented approach is the hybrid model, a hybrid model where public finances cover the non-revenue or the public good component, such as the planning part, the infrastructure, the risk reduction aspects. And these aspects create the conditions for private investment in those revenue-generating elements that have more or less a predictable revenue streams, such as the user fees and service charges and so on. And again, this is one of the contributions of the guide. It provides these very practical business cases that can be used to dissect an investment to see what aspects fall in which bucket. So the key questions become which adaptation investments can generate revenue and which genuinely require public finances, especially given what we've acknowledged already in this chat. Public finances are scarce. How can we then optimize the allocation of scarce public resources to maximize impact. And this is where I think the guide emphasizes distinguishing investments by revenue potential. So I think that is a very important contribution. What the bank often supports is really ensuring that these models are reflected in governance systems, are reflected in public investment management programs, are approved by ministers of finance, and it's embedded within the role and functions of ministers of finance, and is compatible with debt and fiscal frameworks, regulatory frameworks, so that again, it's not treated as a standalone, isolated document, but an overarching whole of government strategy that is built in the institution itself. This is how private capital becomes replicable, repeatable, and not just exceptional. Another important point I want to communicate is the bank already provides a lot of adaptation finance through multiple channels, including through our lending or policy-based operations, and instruments such as or CAT DDOs or contingent emergency financing component instruments. So they're there, and countries are accessing these revenue streams. Although these are not substitutable for the wide array of financing sources, they are delivery mechanisms, and their effectiveness really depend on how countries prioritize adaptation, the financing pathways, and these things. What we're seeing, though, as an emerging issue is that many of these instruments run into problems when it comes to execution. So a country may have contingent financing in place to respond to certain emergencies. When the emergency is triggered, we realize that certain systems are not there to facilitate quick response. Procurement bottlenecks are one of the most common problems, where emergency procedures are not well established, so procurement becomes a bottleneck. Or fiscal transparency, the reporting on how the funds are used, the systems are not there, or interim audit. So the many problems tend to emerge after the disaster is triggered. So we're trying to shift mindsets from being reactive to these emergencies to being proactive and building response in the PFM system itself. And again, this is why phase 4, emphasizing the guide, is so very crucial and very important. It determines whether financing flows smoothly or gets stalled when the financing is triggered. To wrap things up, really, for many countries, the next step after the guide is published, it's not another strategy. It's more, how do we embed these priorities in budget cycles, in financing rules, so that we can operationalize the strategy. And for partners, including the bank, the opportunity is really to align the support that we give to that, emphasizing the strategy, the NAPs, the LTSs, financing instruments that really reinforce each other, so that we complement rather than compete. And I see a lot of complementarities between this guide and other notes that the bank has published and is working on currently. So capacity building therefore becomes very important, not just technical. And so let me close by saying, at the end of the day, scaling adaptation finance is about one simple test. It's really, can countries prioritize, can their priorities be made into investable decisions, investable projects, or is it going to be a standalone decision? And I think the framework really provides a strong starting point to do that, and the bank stands ready to contribute to institutionalizing and financing these opportunities. Let me stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Richard. I think, that's, again, I think a very sort of comprehensive look at the issue. I think it's very difficult to actually summarize, because you've actually brought up a lot of important points. I would say that, your sort of punchline at the end, I think, is important. It should not be a standalone. I mean, the priorities have to be part of the investment and investment vehicles of the country. There also needs to be fiscal space. This is very difficult because countries are very, very resource constrained at the moment. And I think adaptation, they're very squeezed with the adaptation finance. But as you mentioned, there are instruments, but then they also run into a lot of bottlenecks, at the system level, or actually when executing. So, perhaps there are more instruments or availability than is being accessed. We don't know. But I think those kinds of issues, I mean, even as you said, right? I mean, issues such as procurement, when you have to actually deal with an emergency, and for adaptation over the long term, there will be, like there's a trend of more and more increasing emergencies, even though adaptation is a long-term response, we have to deal with those. So even there, the systemic bottlenecks need to be addressed. And I'm also glad that that as a bank, you have, given the bank's perspective on bankability, but also why phase 3 and phase 4 are important, and phase 1 and phase 2 are equally important, but can be, invested by many other actors. So I think that's very, very useful. There are so many, I think, questions in our chat as well. So I'm actually going to thank you, Richard, and I'm going to ask Liam, my colleague Liam, to moderate the Q&A session, which we'll have for about 10-15 minutes, and then we can proceed. So thank you. Over to you, Liam.
Thank you very much, Rohini. Thank you very much to everyone who has contributed so far in this webinar. You've asked many questions in the chat already, both in the chat and the Q&A. So what I've done here is I've taken the liberty of picking out a couple of questions. The first one of which I'm going to answer myself, then I'm going to bring back our panelists. If there are other burning questions, then please do either raise your hand or put the question in the chat now. So the first question that I just want to pick out and spotlight was from Binaya Raj Shivakoti, who asks, mainstreaming NAP at the local level is a prominent challenge for governments, especially in mobilizing finance. Any insights from the guide in that direction? Yes, absolutely. There is an insight from the guide about this exact topic. And it's an example from Kenya, where I'm currently sitting, and a program called FLOCA, which is designed to do exactly that. This is the country's process that was designed as part of the NAP process here in Kenya to channel funds for adaptation investment at the local level. So I won't go into that in any great detail here, but I would encourage you to look at the guide and look at the FLOCA example from Kenya, because that speaks to exactly the nature of the question that you've just asked. Richard, I don't know if I can take the liberty of bringing you back in, but there's a couple of questions here that are, I think, very much aimed at the bank, even though they don't say so explicitly. So there was one question that said, could the panelists comment on considerations critical for designing bankable climate finance programs and projects? That's the first question. And the second question from Octavio de Araujo, do you have examples for effective mechanisms to involve the private sector in financing NDC and NAP? Richard, I hope you don't mind me taking the liberty of directing these questions to you, but they do seem very appropriate. Maribel, you also switched on your camera, so do feel free to come in on those as well. But Richard, maybe over to you first. Over.
Thank you very much, Liam. Let me start with a few thoughts on the first question around bankable projects and the conditions for designing those. So to begin with, I think the first is really helping countries to build the internal capacity to develop these projects. Many times over, we see that the projects are very high-level concepts and they're not operational. So I think bankability starts with a clear problem definition, clearing the scope of the specific climate vulnerability that is being addressed, geographic systems, the direct causal link between the investment and the reduced link. So basic internal capacity to design and develop projects is a very important starting point. One that the bank is itself trying to support, work with many of the climate funds to build that internal capacity. I think the distinction between public good and revenue generating components of a project is also important. And again, this was emphasized in the guide when it looks at the planning and data aspects and the level of investments and risk reduction. I think these are very important because bankability improves how or when public finances are used to reduce risk versus the uncertainty of upfront costs. So it's really trying to disentangle the difference between revenue generating investments and those that require public investments. The last point I would say about this is really the institutional anchoring and the avoidance of treating the system as, or the system as a project, right? A project design, and then running into the problem of having parallel systems to for example, the public investment management system. Projects are bankable only if they are really embedded within the public investment programs and not treated as separate, as we sometimes call it, separate pet projects, right? So to the extent that they can, countries, as they design these bankable projects, also refine the public investment management systems to systematically identify projects that contribute to adaptation goals consistent with medium-term frameworks and approved under normal finance ministry decision channels. I think this leads to a better operationalization of the NAPs, and one that consistently emphasizes that standalone projects have very low chances of succeeding over the long term, but these institutionalized pathways really have a stronger chance of success. So let me stop there, and maybe Maribel, you may have thoughts about the other aspects, but because I'm coming from the governance side, we don't deal so much with the private sector mobilization, but there are some things I can add. But let me hand over to Maribel on that.
Thank you, Richard. No, I think you cover most of the aspects, and I don't want to repeat what you've just mentioned. Yeah, totally agree on your points. Maybe I can start answering on the private sector side to give you some examples. So I think that the answer depends on what is the private sector that we are thinking of, and what is the role of this private sector, and how we envisage the involvement and investment of the private sector. For instance, we have very nice examples in Honduras, where the Bank Association worked with commercial banks in Honduras to help them understand climate, physical risks, and also the opportunities of investing in resilience. And now, so some years after this effort from the, so it was the Bank Association, AHIBA, in collaboration with the Inter-American Development Bank, we see that there are some commercial banks in Honduras that are proposing sort of resiliency-linked bonds, loans. So they are providing money for farmers, for other, it's not only directed to the agriculture sector, but they are providing loans for adaptation specific activities. So this is a very good way of bringing the private sector to the table, with raising awareness and also explaining the business case of investing on adaptation, and also not only talking about risks, but also talking about the opportunities of investing in adaptation, because the private sector can have multiple roles. It can invest directly in adaptation, like, I don't know, impact investors or even companies under the ESG policies. They can invest in adaptation. Others invest in protecting as a way of managing their own risks, the risk associated to climate change. And other private sector entities could act as intermediaries for that. And one other interesting example, we have it in Colombia, where we have, so is in Spanish is el Corredor de Finanzas Climáticas, which is could be like a climate finance broker, which is a way through which the Colombian government is facilitating the engagement of private sector actors to invest in adaptation through different aspects. And you can send a bit more information about this. I don't know if there's someone from Colombia in the room now, but yeah, very, very interesting activity, which is I think working very well, where the government is putting in place a system which is facilitating something which you mentioned, Richard, which is the providing investment ready projects or investment, or actionable investment. So two examples like this. And I think that also guarantees and all the risking mechanisms are very important to bring the private sector to and help them decide to invest in adaptation. And also and we can see it also when working with the intermediaries. For instance, guarantees, governments can provide some funding to banks that can then lower or provide better conditions for the loans that they are going to provide to their clients if they invest in adaptation. So these are some, and this is something that we see, for instance, in Indonesia with the CARA program. So yeah, there are different examples globally from different types of private sector entities investing in adaptation. As I say, they have different goals, but this is something which is happening, and I think we have to push for more much more of this. And it doesn't have to be super complex, right? Because I think it's like we always think big infrastructure project and PPPs, but it doesn't have to be that. It could be like help farmers, help households, help invest to adapt themselves to climate change and other things. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you, Maribel. There's one more question here from Deepak that I will just take very quickly myself, just to give a quick answer. Deepak asks, how do you see climate adaptation actions in which the return would be more qualitative and not have a financial return? You may remember from the presentation that we highlighted the different business models for adaptation projects. There are clearly projects that generate revenue in things like agriculture or water supply, but there are public good projects that do not generate revenue. And this is where we need a continued role for public finance, right? Because some adaptation projects will not be suitable for private investment because they have no obvious revenue stream. So we absolutely do understand that while there is scope for the private sector to invest in adaptation where there is revenue generating potential, there is also there are public good projects that do not generate revenue. So there is a continued need to mobilize international and domestic public finance for adaptation, and the guideline very much acknowledges that. So with that, I'm very sorry to all. There were many questions that we received in the chat through both the Q&A and the chat. I'm very sorry that we have not managed to get to all or even a majority of those questions, but we are running a little bit behind on time now. In the presentation and in the webinar materials that we will send round, there is the contact information for Christina and myself. We would be very happy to keep up the dialogue with any and all of you after the webinar and try our best to answer any questions that you may have and continue this conversation. But for now, I will close the question and answer session, and I will hand over to my colleague Assad for his closing thoughts and remarks. So Assad, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Liam. I think it's been a brilliant discussion, very, very rich questions, and also, I mean, the reflections that we got from the speakers. I mean, a few takeaways. So the first is that, I mean, how does adaptation become a natural part of the development process? I mean, that's one of the key message that I saw was coming from all the speakers, and how it gets embedded into the financial architecture. That's the first. And the second was, which Richard and Maribel also mentioned, and Sam too, that the adaptation as part of the climate change and in order to strengthen resilience should be anchored in the institutions and in the policy. So because that's of course the foundation for any effective financing strategy or investment plan. And then the next one, which I would mention, is the national and the sub-national angle. At the national level, it's sectoral. It could be comprehensive, but the point that was made around the flexibility, because I mean, different countries are at different development stages. So your strategy, your financing strategy depends upon the availability of data, upon the systems that are in place, the robustness of the private sector, the financial architecture that you have. So you need to respond to what you have rather than creating something new. And I mean, equally important is the role of the subnational governments, which at times, I mean, is not given due attention, and that's also something that I saw in the chat box as well. But at the end of the day, I mean, there are two things that we still struggle with, and that was the challenge that was eminent in the question as well, which is one on the economic value of adaptation. So which appeals to the ministries of finance and which appeals to the private sector. At times it's a long-term investment, and at times it is a short-term investment, and that's where some of these financing instruments can be really helpful. Maribel, you mentioned the guarantees. I mean, how the banking system can basically respond to the green financing requirements. Lastly, I think, I mean, that point was also mentioned in the opening remarks, but we all need to work together. That's, I think, the key. At the country level, we keep hearing about the country platforms. So the development partners should come together, different arms within the government, the ministries of environment, the sector ministries, the ministries of finance, and I mean the regulators. They all should come together. And of course, I mean, it's something which is going to take time for the financing strategy also to reap its benefits. So I'll stop here. Well, thank you all, and also thanks to the government of UK and government of Sweden, with the support of whom we were able to put together this adaptation financing strategy, and pass on to Emma Wright, who is the regional climate and environment advisor with the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the government of UK. Over to you, Emma.
Thanks, Asad, and thanks everyone for this wonderful session, and thanks to UNDP for organising this today, and for all of our speakers for such a rich and practical discussion and all their contributions, and particular thanks to the Climate Finance Network team, whose work sits at the heart of what we've been discussing today, and the UK is very proud to support the Climate Finance Network under our CARA programme. But really, I think in the interest of time, I just want to leave you all with a few calls to action. So events like this one are how we collectively build the connections and the shared understanding we need to close this adaptation gap. It's really great to see colleagues from all around the world here. I'm based in India, where heat is a massive problem now, and I think we can all agree that
Emma, I think you're on mute. Sorry.
Sorry. I think, thank you so much. I think the call to action I really want to leave you with is that no one can do this alone. And so we need to carry on holding these conversations and developing new partnerships and new collaborations to close the adaptation gap. But also, like, after this, get together after the call, make new friends, talk it out, think about who else you need to bring into the conversation in your country or your context, what helps your Ministry of Finance understand the risks and the benefits, and how that then comes down to subnational level. Ask the questions. No one knows the answers on their own. So I'm really grateful to the CFM for putting this together. I think as the UK, we remain committed to playing our part. We're moving from more of a donor to more of an investor, but we're really excited about the opportunities for scale that this offers. So we are going to continue to help convene as far as we can through institutions, but really it's up to all of us together to work on this collectively and share all our lessons from our different countries and contexts to make us all collectively more able to address this problem. So thank you very much, everyone, and congratulations to the CFN team and all the speakers. Thank you, Richard, Maribel and Dr. Sam and Rohini and Asad and everyone who contributed to this. And I hope that we can also pick up on all your questions in slower time. So thanks so much from the UK.
Thank you very much, Emma, and also thank you, AFSG, and to everyone that has attended this webinar. I think we are right on time. And I think we have really, really benefited from a very rich conversation. And with that, we are going to be closing the webinar and see you all again sometime.